Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. I'm Sarah Van Exen, and I'm GreenPac's Executive Director. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors for supporting our work and making it possible for us to hold events like these. And of course, I'd like to thank our panelists and each of you for joining events like this one, particularly today when we're going to be learning about the environmental implications of the federal budget, which if you're showing up here today, I'm guessing you already know are significant. In a few minutes, our panel will dig a bit deeper into what this budget does on that front and how it lives up to expectations. First, I want to recognize we're joining today from Indigenous land across what is now called Canada. I myself am joining you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and Wendat peoples in what's now called Toronto. As part of my learning about the land that I'm on, I've learned that I'm joining you right on top of a buried river that was home to Indigenous communities and part of trade routes before it was jammed into a concrete pipe. And it's still part of an active title claim to the unceded waterways and watersheds in this area by the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as I continue my learning, I plan to find out more about Indigenous perspectives on this budget. We don't have an Indigenous panelist here today. If you don't know GreenPac, we aim to see the health of our planet become a driving force in politics at all levels. And we work to inspire, amplify, and activate environmental leadership in that pursuit. And I hope you'll check us out. If you're between 18 and 30, applications for our parliamentary internship for the environment open next week. We have an hour to talk about a 250-page document, which, as budgets go, is actually fairly brief. But we may not have time for audience questions today. If we're making a lot of quick progress, then we'll let you know and we'll open up the Q&A midway so you can enter your questions and we'll add a few at the end. And now with thanks, I'd like to turn it over to David Thornton, who's the Director of Regulatory and Public Affairs, who will introduce our fabulous moderator.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to represent EDF Renewables in GreenPac's first event of 2023. EDF has been a proud sponsor of GreenPac over the years, and we're very excited to be back this year. I'm David Thornton. I work for EDF Renewables Canada. EDF Renewables is one of the largest clean renewable energy generators in the world. For the last 30 years, EDF Renewables has been building and operating renewable energy projects in over 20 countries. From small microgrid rooftop solar installations to the largest offshore wind projects to the latest green hydrogen production technologies. In Canada, our team has built nearly 2 gigawatts of wind, solar, and energy storage systems. That represents an investment of over $4.5 billion into Canada's electric grid. I won't steal any thunder for the upcoming conversation, but I have been working in the renewable industry for over a decade now, and yesterday was a big day. $80 billion over the next decade in clean energy investments is a big deal. I also note a continued focus on achieving a net zero grid by 2035. That's another big deal. So if I may say one thing in the hopes that it sticks with you and perhaps is picked up in the roundtable, I wanted to make a comment about the importance of transmission investments. As a generator, the investment tax credit announced on Tuesday will be significant. It will allow Canada to maintain competitiveness and keep electricity bills low. But the grid itself will need to double, perhaps triple in size to attain any net zero future. So I do want to acknowledge there is mention of interprovincial transmission support in the Clean Electricity ITC. I was also very encouraged to see that so within provincial boundaries, the federal government is looking to focus on provincial transmission investments. So as I look ahead to 2023, and I'm very, very excited to begin the work on designing the ITC, EDF Renewables will be actively discussing the event value that federal dollars with provincial priority transmission projects, now that's distribution to high voltage wires, will be critical in attaining the net zero grid. So onto my formal duties. It's my pleasure to announce today, or introduce today, Shakti Ramkumar. Shakti Ramkumar is a Senior Director of Policy and Communications at Student Energy. Shakti oversees the organization's strategic communications and digital engagement, and she trains youth on policy advocacy and climate communications. She also leads the development of accessible energy education content for the Energy Systems Map, which has reached 14 million users globally. So with that immense resume, I gladly hand the webinar over to you, Shakti.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction and also for your perspective on the importance of transmission investments. And I believe, related concepts will come up today. Thank you very much for having me to moderate this webinar. I'm here to learn along with everyone else. So I'm very thrilled to welcome our 3 expert panelists today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Runa Das. Dr. Das is an associate professor in the College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Royal Roads University in Victoria. She holds a PhD in Environmental Applied Science and Management from Toronto Metropolitan University. Her interdisciplinary research focuses mostly on residential energy use, including equitable household energy transitions in Canada. Our second panelist is Marissa Beck. Marissa is the Clean Growth Director at the Canadian Climate Institute. Her research areas include climate and energy policy, clean growth, and evidence-based decision-making. She's worked in academia, with NGOs, and in the private sector. And Marissa holds a PhD in global governance from the University of Waterloo. And last but not least, our third panelist is Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood. Hadrian is a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His work focuses on the social and economic dimensions of Canada's shift towards a zero carbon economy, including the necessity of a just transition for vulnerable workers and communities across the country. So I'm so thrilled to have our 3 panelists here today to comment on Budget 2023. And I know we have a lot of exciting questions, so I will dive right in. Let's start with an overall analysis of the budget. How does it move the needle in terms of the environment? And maybe I'll go to Marissa first.
Yeah, happy to give a quick overview. We think it does move the needle. It provides a really strong foundation for Canada's achievement of both Canada's emissions reduction target, but also a strong foundation for clean growth and for Canada's competitiveness and economic prosperity in a rapidly changing global economy towards a low carbon future. So what we've seen in the budget is a really strong focus on that issue area. It has been a response to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. I will talk about that more a little bit later. And I would kind of mirror or repeat David's emphasis on electricity. I think the strong support that this budget provides for electricity generation, transmission, and so on is crucial to achieving both emission reduction targets, but also setting a strong foundation for Canada's competitiveness in a net zero world. So yes, our opinion is it does move the needle. It's a very shrewd, strategic step forward for Canada on its clean growth journey.
Amazing. Thank you, Marissa. And maybe over to Hadrian next for how does this move the needle in terms of the environment?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks a lot for having me here. I won't repeat what Marissa said. So I agree with that assessment that this is a significant, this investment or incentive package is worth about $80 billion over the next decade, which is huge. It's one of the biggest climate spends we've seen in a budget. But I will say, I'll just introduce 2 caveats into the discussion early. One is that there is almost all this money is incentives to the private sector, which is not bad in and of itself, but it's sort of asking the market to figure out how to solve this problem. And there's a case to be made for that. But I think we'd like to see a little bit more actual leadership and direction from the government in terms of where we're going. And then the second issue is that this is all carrots, right? Like this is all the good stuff. It's nice to talk about budgets, it's nice to talk about spending, it's nice to talk about green growth. What's going on with fossil fuels? So the budget does not talk about that. And you really need to pair these sorts of incentives with actual regulations that will help us move away from fossil fuel production and use, not just build out the clean economy.
Yeah, very important observation, Hadrian. And finally to Runa, how does the budget move the needle in terms of the environment?
Thanks, Shakti. With respect to moving the needle, I think the needle is moving in the right direction. By scaling up support for clean energy in this budget, the government of Canada is effectively signaling its commitment to decarbonizing our electricity system. So I think that's really great. I think, it's due time. So apart from the actual dollar amount, is an understanding on the part of the Canada government that we need to energy transition. And this is being communicated quite clearly with the rest of Canada. They're saying, hey, this needs to happen. Indeed, many times they discuss needing to keep up with other countries, including the US, and the race to build clean economies and the global shift to net zero. So obviously this is a budget, and we see that linking of clean energy and energy transition as important for Canada's economy as a whole, the broader economy, but also there are many references to the co-benefits of the clean economy. So health and prosperity for all Canadians. So I think this is really, really important. So we're seeing the tying of addressing climate change to various benefits. And I think it's really great to acknowledge this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Another general question on the budget before we dive into a little bit more detail. So this budget definitely had a lot more new spending in all areas than anyone expected, and it's projected to grow the deficit significantly. Staying at a super high level, if you want to comment on growing the deficit, and also how does the budget live up to the advanced expectations? And this time I'll go to Hadrian first.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Well, as Marissa mentioned earlier, and I won't steal her thunder, but we were expecting a response to the Inflation Reduction Act. So we did expect there to be something in terms of kind of tax incentives to compete with the US. I don't know that anyone expected it to be worth so much. I think the dollar figure kind of surprised me and others. I think one of the other interesting things about this budget, and something that Sarah actually mentioned at the top, is it's actually kind of a short budget, and that's because it's like very focused on a few things. So we got like dental care, we got all this clean spending, and there's like not a lot else in it. It's a bit of an unusual budget on that front. So it in some ways it wasn't really what we were expecting, but the big spend on climate is certainly welcome.
Great, thank you. And I'll go to Marissa next.
Yeah, sure. I think what I would mention here from a very big picture, this budget is really, or the government in developing this budget was facing at least two key tensions. And one, I think, is included in this question. It's that idea that, well, we need to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act, and we need to put some money on the table. That is what this moment needs and what is expected. And that money should be enough to really make a change, to move that needle, as the first question suggested. And on the other hand, of course, that needs to be balanced with this idea of fiscal restraint and avoiding over-subsidization. We don't want to spend public dollars that simply become windfall profits for, incumbent industries that goes to projects that would have happened without that public support or with less of it. So there's a tension there, how much to spend. And then the other tension that is related to that is the question on what. There's this idea of using public funds in a very targeted way to make sure that we're really promoting the areas where Canada has competitive advantage, where Canada can really kind of build its clean growth portfolio. But then on the other hand, also there is this idea that governments shouldn't get involved in picking winners and exactly letting the market forces figure out which solutions are the most competitive and the most promising. So I think these tensions and that those are a huge lift. That is a very challenging task to balance these tensions. And we had always urged kind of in our analysis running up to the budget for the government not to simply replicate the Inflation Reduction Act, because that would be a very expensive way to respond to it and not necessarily in Canada's interest or making Canada more competitive in that sense even. So this budget has, in a way, responded to this tension and has found its own solution.
Shakti, we can't hear you.
Tensions and discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Marissa. Maybe it was just me. You froze for a second, but you're back now.
Sorry
so
about that.
All good. All good. And I'll move to Runa next. So just to repeat the question, the budget did have a lot more spending in all areas than anyone expected, and it's projected to grow the deficit significantly. How does the budget live up to advanced expectations?
For me, I didn't find really any big surprises, in the sense that I think that spending is necessary and needed to develop the clean economy in the transition. I want to note, I think the provision of the $3 billion over 13 years to NRCan for the expansion of the smart renewables and electrification pathways program as well as the renewing of the smart grid program and creating new investments in offshore wind to be really good, because here we're seeing local distributed energy resource investment and not just mega infrastructure, which I think is important, absolutely, in the transition, but I think we should also be focusing on this other aspect of the transition. And I do want to mention that with this budget, there's a lot of spending to attract business and innovation, obviously really, really important. But what I found missing was investment in research and talent, which should be very much included in how we address building the clean economy of the future. The budget mentions that nearly 2.4 billion in budget 2018 was spent on Canada's research system, which includes the National Granting Councils. This budget mentions that in order to maintain research strength, our systems need to support science and research, and that needs to evolve, and that it's been consulting with stakeholders, and that details will come out. But we need to really see this. Graduate student stipends are below the poverty line in Canada, and there's often limitations to how much one can work after they take on these stipends. So I think that there really needs to be more support for science and research in this clean economy and in this transition.
Thank you, Runa. Yeah, that's definitely of special interest to us as well at Student Energy, as we see so many young people who want to take action on energy and build a career in this space, but it's so difficult to pursue further studies or be a researcher or really, develop your experience in the stage without having the necessary financial support and the investments and the programs that really enable youth in Canada to do so. So a very important note to end it on. Now we'll dive into more of our targeted in-depth questions. But thank you for sharing your general kind of overview of the budget. The first one is for Marissa. So how does this budget aim to spur investment in clean energy in Canada? And you'll have 2 minutes for this answer.
Okay, great. So there's actually one diagram in the budget that I think kind of sums up the composition of the measures and kind of the strategic thinking behind it very nicely, and that is a pyramid. It's on page 74 if someone wants to quickly look at it while I talk about it. So it's a pyramid. It's a pyramid of different policy measures or tools that this budget includes. And what is noticeable is that the bottom of the pyramid, so kind of the broadest chunk of it, is carbon pricing and regulations like low carbon fuel standards. So what that clearly signals is that this budget still sees carbon pricing, despite all the carrots that Hadrian mentioned earlier, still sees carbon pricing, which is usually considered kind of a stick policy or a policy stick, as the foundation for Canada's kind of clean growth policies. On top of carbon pricing, we then have a layer of investment tax credits. Some of those were announced earlier. We now have a bit more details about them. Some of them are newly introduced, and those really address a fairly broad range of technologies and activities, including, we mentioned it, clean electricity, from production, transmission, and so on, clean hydrogen, clean technology adoption and manufacturing, and other technologies as well. So a fairly broad layer of investment tax credits. On top of that, a bit narrower, again, we're looking at the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Canada Growth Fund, which are kind of introduced or designated to become green banks for Canada. So acting as banks that support strategically important projects through more bespoke risk-sharing mechanisms. So here's really where we see kind of market mechanism being brought to the fore. And I think this is really where the CIB and the CGF will work on crowding in that private investment that is necessary. I think both other panelists mentioned before, this budget is really designed to leverage private investment. Canada needs that investment. We need to make huge investments in the clean economy. This cannot happen with public money alone. The purpose is really to spend public money to attract more private money. And then at the top of the pyramid, we have kind of at the smallest scale and the most narrowest, very targeted programs, like specific funds for specific technologies, and so on. So that kind of provides the top of the pyramid. And I find that this illustration so informative and so telling, especially, again, just to reiterate again, because the foundation is still carbon pricing and our regulations, and then everything else that comes up top on that is kind of in a bit of a narrow scope. So I find that a really nice summary of all the measures that this budget includes for the clean economy.
Thank you, Marissa. And that was such helpful context for kind of the carrot and stick policies that are seem more heavily weighted towards the carrot policies, but this pyramid really emphasizes how much a little bit of the stick policies and carbon pricing is so essential to supporting the rest of that work. Next, I will, and thank you, Hadrian, for dropping the pyramid in the chat, very helpful. And next, I'll move to Runa. What else will we find in terms of electricity transmission, energy efficiency, and support for energy transition at the local level, especially for individual households?
Thanks, Shakti. Before I mention that the needle, I think that the needle has moved overall. But when it comes to individual households in Canada, I don't think the needle has, moved much at all with this budget. I think there's lots of things missing here in terms of benefits for Canadian households. I found that a lot of this budget was very top down and concerned with the supply, but not really figuring out what to do with demand. And I think both need to, go hand in hand as we transition. So I see very much missing the supports for households. Transitioning people off of fossil fuel compatible heating systems, for example, is going to be really important as we move to electrify. So I would have liked to have seen more large scale heat pump incentives or a framework around that. We need to see supports for people to adopt the technology, that goes along with the infrastructure that's being, built to support electrification. Not all people go out and adopt technology. They need incentives, they need supports. Research shows this. There is evidence around this stuff. Also, there's no new energy efficiency retrofits included in this grant, and funds from the National Housing Strategy have been reallocated to new builds or new construction. So I think we need to spend on affordable housing, absolutely, but not at the expense of retrofitting our existing stock. And we have a lot of it. Many people live in homes that need to be retrofitted across the country, and Canadian households could very much benefit from retrofits. There's a lot in budget 2023 with respect to electric vehicles manufacturing and developing critical minerals as well as the supply chains, but a barrier to EV adoption is a charging station. And we know this happens in multifamily buildings or MURBs. So more infrastructure is needed, again, for the demand. And it seems, there needs to be more on that side. And I felt that was missing from this budget.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Runa. That is a very important point, I think, because energy efficiency, as we were mentioning earlier, does come with those co-benefits as well. It creates so many jobs, investments in retrofits, energy efficiency, and demand side solutions do have potential to come with other co-benefits. So definitely an important area to see more investment in, and it's a shame that this budget may not necessarily have really delved into all the possibilities there. Thank you. And next, I'll move to Hadrian. Can you tell us about transitional policy for communities and workers in this budget?
Yeah, there aren't any. So next question. No, I can go into a little bit more detail. But yeah, there is really nothing in here about how do we transition, especially like fossil fuel communities is a big one. But just communities across the country that would include, for example, Indigenous communities that depend on diesel, slightly addressed. But I think there's basically two reasons why there's not actually a lot of transition talk in this budget. There's a good reason and a bad reason. The good reason is that we just had a sustainable jobs plan announced by the government last month, and it kind of covers this whole issue of, how do we make sure that we're prioritizing workers, prioritizing communities as we make this transition to zero carbon economy. And that the sustainable jobs plan has like 10 action items. It's quite comprehensive. It's not perfect, but that kind of addresses this issue. So that's the kind of giving the government the benefit of the doubt answer. The other reason why I think there's not a lot of transition language in this budget is that the federal government has really moved away from any language around transitioning oil and gas in general, maybe for political reasons, but there's a big change there's a big difference between saying we are going to wind down or phase out fossil fuels, which is exactly what we're doing with coal. We made that very clear with federal and provincial policy. We will have no coal power in this country, and we're going to support those communities, those industries to transition to, or those workers to transition to new industries. With oil and gas, we have really changed the narrative, actually. So now it's less about we're not going to be producing oil and gas. It's we're going to use our oil, we're going to use carbon capture so we can produce low carbon oil and gas and export it, and then it'll get burned somewhere else, but that's not our problem. We'll continue to use our oil and gas infrastructure to now produce hydrogen, to continue to produce petrochemicals. But in any of these scenarios, we're still a major oil and gas producer, which is the biggest source of emissions in the country. So I think it's kind of for both those reasons that we don't really talk about transition, because if you're not going to phase out oil and gas, you don't need to transition those workers.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting point. And I'd like to bring in Runa to kind of weigh in on this as well. Can you also tell us whether this budget signals that the government plans to pay for its investment in a clean energy transition by decreasing fossil fuel subsidies? From what Hadrian's saying, it seems like there isn't as much detail on a transition plan, or any at all. And then what you were saying, there's not much investment in on the demand side either. So does it seem from this budget that the government plans to pay for its investment in the clean energy transition?
I don't have a whole lot to add on this question, but with this budget, I mean, the government is signaling an energy transition by investing in electrification, but it's very much keeping open supporting of fossil fuels in that transition. I mean, we're seeing tax credits for abated natural gas, fossil hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, or other fossil fuel subsidies. So the problem is these investments have long-term effects and they add to this path dependence. And so I see a little bit of a backwards forwards kind of thing going on here.
Yeah, thank you. And Marissa, you talked about this a little bit earlier, but this budget has been hyped as, Canada's opportunity to respond to last year's historic Inflation Reduction Act, which definitely made headlines. At the same time, the finance minister has been under pressure to explore fiscal restraint. So how ambitious is this budget in the end on creating conditions for Canadian clean competitiveness versus the United States?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for sure, this budget is Canada's response to the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course was passed last summer and is a very broad, large-scale subsidy package of around $370 billion US for clean technology adoption and manufacturing. And so Canada, as a key trading partner of the US, of course, was under pressure to respond, and it is good that the government has taken action. And as I said earlier, it would have not been good to simply replicate the US Inflation Reduction Act. It was important that Canada found its own approach to this response. It would have been very expensive to go out and simply kind of match it dollar by dollar from scratch. Because Canada really has, I'm going to reemphasize that again, has one important competitive advantage over the US. It has a federal economy-wide carbon price, which the US doesn't. So what that means is that with the carbon price, Canada already has a strong policy lever in place to incentivize investment in decarbonization. The US doesn't have that. So in the US, all that heavy lifting has to be done through subsidies, which are very, very expensive. So here again, that carrot stick comparison, Canada has an effective stick in place. So all that work in the US has to be done through carrots. And so what we've seen again with this budget reaffirming, it is still the bottom of the pyramid. Carbon pricing is important, and it will stay important and will continue to be the foundation for Canada's clean growth policies. And what I forgot to mention earlier is where we see a new component to carbon pricing here to strengthen the investment effect of that policy even more is something called carbon contracts for difference, where the government has confirmed its commitment to introducing these kinds of contracts. And I think that is a term that has been thrown around quite a bit in the last 2 days. So just for a super quick explainer how they work, these are basically contracts that can guarantee the benchmark carbon price will rise as is planned up to 2030. So we have a carbon price trajectory. It's supposed to go up to $170 per ton in 2030. But there is uncertainty around, will the carbon price actually rise that way? Will government stick to its commitments around carbon pricing? And that kind of uncertainty is not attractive to investors because it makes them hesitant to put large amounts of capital investments out and on the table if they cannot be sure that the carbon price will actually be what it's supposed to be. So carbon contracts for difference come in as kind of an insurance mechanism. Should the price not rise as announced, the government will step in and pay the difference to investors. So investors can take this policy or this incentive, this support as guaranteed in their investment calculations. So that's a big step, and kind of carbon pricing is not a carrot, so it is more fiscally restrained than handing out subsidies. And again, the commitment of the government to make carbon pricing to remain, keep it as its main tool, complement it, make it more strong, a stronger investment signal by introducing carbon contracts for difference. That is really what sets this budget apart from the US Inflation Reduction Act and makes it more fiscally restrained as well.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Marissa. It was really, I learned a lot there. So thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, we'll move to Hadrian and just asking, how does this budget aim to keep life affordable for Canadians as part of its transition measures?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just want to echo Marissa's enthusiasm about carbon contracts for differences, which is something that us policy nerds really care about. But it doesn't sound that exciting, but it's actually very important policy. Anyway, yeah, affordability. So affordability was like a big concern coming into this budget because everyone is rightly stressed out about inflation. And I mean, there's some general affordability stuff, right? Like, I mean, the big investment in dental is really important, especially for low-income households. So we got this GST rebate for groceries, which I don't know how big a difference that'll make. Stuff there for student grants and loans and whatever. There's also things that actually really matter for affordability that the budget does not address, like housing being a big one, transit being another one. Now, the federal government is spending on transit, and again, you have to think about any budget in the context of past budgets, but we would have liked to see more on transit housing, especially. But on the climate piece specifically, there is really nothing in there. And this comes back to a lot of the points Runa was making earlier around like how are we actually supporting individuals and households to make these sorts of changes in their lives or make these sorts of investments in retrofitting their homes or switching to electric vehicles or whatever. There's not really anything in there. There's certainly no mention of climate justice. Like that phrase is not going to appear in this budget. And as I was saying earlier, there's no transition plans here for, again, fossil fuel communities, which it seems may never have to transition away from fossil fuels.
Sorry, Shakti, could I quickly?
Of course.
Good
Yeah.
on time. I have actually a quick question about that. So Hadrian, how would you, I'm interested, how would you see the labor requirements that are tied to the investment tax credit? So that, in my understanding, is a new thing. It's the first time that a Canadian budget does that. And so basically, just to quickly explain, the investment tax credit, to receive the maximum level of tax credits, this budget requires companies to meet certain labor requirements. And for example, paying kind of regionally, what was the exact phrasing? So kind of fair payment.
Prevailing wages, thank you. And employing a certain ratio of apprentices. So yeah, I would just like to hear your thoughts on that. That seemed to me a component that maybe goes into that direction that you just alluded to. I'd be interesting to hear your views on that. Well, I was going to talk about it for the next question, but thank you for bringing it up. No, it's really important. And it's a big win for the workers and the unions, especially, that have been pushing for this sort of thing. Because yeah, this is going to ensure it's not literally a wage floor, but it's going to ensure that, or at least put pressure on employers to create good jobs as they're benefiting from these public investments. And the apprenticeship piece is really important because, again, I think it's something that Runa was mentioning earlier. We're just kind of, I think, largely missing the boat on skills training, and we need to be thinking long term about this. Like, we're going to need a lot of people to do retrofits in the next 10 years, and you need to start training them like 5 years ago. So anything that supports apprenticeships and skills training in general is good. And yeah, and I mean, another labor piece that's in there is anti-scab legislation. So, which is again going to help protect unions and ultimately, hopefully, protect workers. I think that's all great stuff. I mean, there's some caveats, like they're not actually mandatory conditions, but if you don't meet them, you don't receive the same incentive. So it's a good incentive, and hopefully it works. And I think from my impression, like the labor unions are quite excited about this stuff.
Great, and thank you, Marissa. That was perfectly teed up for our next question anyway, so I'm glad you asked. And I do want to mention to our audience that we've opened up the Q&A for a couple questions. We may have time for one or two, so please go ahead and drop your question in the Q&A function. We'll carry on, but we'll keep an eye on the Q&A as you ask them. Just to kind of wrap up that last question, I think, Hadrian, you addressed most of maybe what you were hoping to cover in that one. But what haven't we discussed that you'd like to highlight, or any of the other panelists as well, if you'd like to jump in terms of how this budget aims to address the well-being of Canadians and the resilience of our communities during this transition that we have before us? And of course, as someone from a youth-led organization, I'm also interested to know, does the budget lay out any plans for youth participation and transition? I think the piece on apprenticeship was very interesting. So if you'd like to build on that, or if other panelists would like to weigh in, would love to know your thoughts.
Sure, I can start and build on that. I mean, yeah, there's this condition that I think it's like 10% of labor hours on supported projects would be for apprentices, which is great. There's not a ton of new money directly for skills training, but there is some. I think the bigger concern for me, especially when we talk about communities, and this comes back to my earlier concern about being kind of leaving too much to the market, is that can be really problematic from a kind of regional perspective. So it may be the case that because of these incentives we provided, that we're going to create a lot of great green jobs in places like Calgary and Edmonton. But if you're, a coal worker in like Hinton, Alberta, which is like 300 kilometers outside of Edmonton, is that really helpful for you that you have a green job that's 300 kilometers away? So that's the kind of example that I think of when we want a little bit more direct government leadership in terms of like, how do we actually support communities and workers where they're at, right? Instead of hoping that the market kind of solves their problems for them. So it's not to suggest that there's no role to play for the market, of course, but I just like to see a little bit more of that kind of conscious targeting of spending so that it's in the places that need it.
Great. Thank you. I'll move on to our next question. So Runa, energy equity is a big focus of your work. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what that means and whether this budget creates opportunities to improve energy equity and environmental justice in Canada?
So not everyone's starting from the same place as we transition. And the idea of energy equity is that we want to see that the benefits of transition to be felt by everyone and experienced by everyone. So these are things like health benefits of using cleaner energy, the affordability benefits of using cleaner energy. And often the people who could really benefit the most are the ones that are starting from a more challenging spot. So they might not have the income to support purchase of new technology, for example. They might not have the means or qualify for loans or grants to support retrofitting their homes. They might not be able to afford purchasing an EV. So from this standpoint, I don't feel that the budget really addresses this. This kind of comes back to my earlier point on leaving the demand side out a little bit and households, not a little bit, quite a bit in this budget. So I just quickly want to mention, just for comparison's sake, the Biden-Harris administration Inflation Reduction Act includes several environmental justice programs, including the Justice 40 initiative, which will deliver 40% of the overall benefits of climate and clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities. So many programs in the US are being reformed to meet the Justice 40 initiative. So I think this is something that really addresses equity. And the federal environmental racism bill passed its third reading yesterday, Bill C-226. So it's a bill for developing a national strategy in Canada to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism. and to advance environmental justice. So, I mean, there is an environmental justice issue that needs to be tackled in Canada. With something like the Smart Renewables and Electrification Pathway Program, we can see they say where applicable, you know, the program will also increase meaningful Indigenous ownership of and benefits from smart renewable energy projects. This is good. This is great stuff. We need to increase and see these kinds of things increase. I do want to mention that in this budget, the CRA is going to triple the number of Canadians that are eligible to file their return. And they're piloting a new automatic filing service for vulnerable people. So approximately 12% of Canadians don't file taxes, and they could be missing out on the benefits that could be delivered through the tax system, such as a carbon rebate or also the climate action incentives. So this is, I think, a really, really good thing, and I'm glad to see that.
Great, thank you, Runa. And just one final question from Marissa before I pick a couple of the audience questions and just offer them to the panel. In this final question, Marissa, can you highlight some of the additional measures in this budget to support a reduction of emissions to net zero by 2050 and drive future prosperity? And I noticed there was a similar question in the Q&A as well on how does the public, build pressure to bring in some of these elements, missing elements in the budget, and how can future generations also participate in this process?
Yeah, happy to share some more thoughts on that. So I think what I would like to do here is really focus again and kind of reiterate the importance of building Canada's clean electricity supply and clean electricity grid. It has come up multiple times in this panel, but it's really fundamental for both achieving emission reductions and laying the foundation for Canada's growth, the economic growth in a low carbon future, because it's the access to abundant and affordable clean power is what makes Canada attractive to international investors and companies and projects as well. So it's really, it's the foundation, it's core. We've seen a lot of action in this budget, and that's a good thing. So I just wanted to bring that up again. And then another point that I wanted to raise, that is kind of hinted at in the budget, but it's closely related, is this idea of a regulatory reform and permitting reform. So this budget and our discussion today has been mostly about dollar values, of course, no surprise. So it's really about getting stuff financed. But to actually make it happen, to get these projects settled in Canada, to get them off the ground, to get shovels in the ground, there's a huge amount of clean technology, clean energy infrastructure that needs to be built in Canada to achieve emissions reduction targets and to stay competitive in the global economy. More is needed. So the next step that the government actually has announced in this budget as well is to take action and reform regulatory approval processes and permitting processes, which right now are often seen as taking a long time and being quite unpredictable. So I just wanted to highlight that there's more work to do. We're kind of, there's been work done on the financing side, but there's more to be done to actually get these projects up and running and get these emissions reductions achieved. And so this budget gives a little spotlight on that, on next steps. And the government is promising to have plans for these kinds of reforms by the end of 2023, so moving relatively fast. And just to highlight again, this is a huge discussion right now in the US as well. So Canada is not alone with that kind of challenge. The US Inflation Reduction Act, of course, incentivizes a bunch of investment, new projects, and so on. But the regulatory approvals and the permitting can't keep up right now with that volume. So again, there's a bit of a shared challenge here, and we'll see what happens over the next months. Just wanted to highlight that it's not done with getting the dollars secured, getting the money secured. More needs to be done to actually implement these projects.
Thanks, Marissa. And I think especially as future generations who will be here seeing the effect of these policies for the long term, that implementation, the pace of implementation, the inclusivity of the implementation is what's key to seeing the success of these.
Yeah, and this is, it might seem quite abstract, this budget and now regulatory processes. This is really important. This is important for Canada's growth, for Canada's economic prosperity and future, and therefore really important for future generations, to find their place in the economy, to find employment, and keep Canada competitive in that sense as well. So this is key. This is really important stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have a couple minutes left, so I will ask some of the questions from the audience Q&A. These are open to any panelists, whoever would like to weigh in. I'll start with the top voted one. So the Inflation Reductions Act has introduced taxing the super rich to fund their initiatives. Why is Canada not doing the same at the same level?
Yeah, good question. I don't actually know what the numbers are in terms of what the IRA is doing. And it is true that this budget did actually include some kind of de facto tax increases on higher incomes, but nothing kind of radical. And this could be one of the solutions. Like sometimes like taxing extremely high incomes is a little bit of theater. Like you get some money, but there just aren't enough people with like super rich incomes for it to actually generate a lot for the government. But I do think that in general, we need to be talking about revenue. We know that this is expensive, no matter how you slice it, doing a lot of the investments we need to do. And I don't think we should be afraid to raise new revenues where we have to.
Runa or Marissa, would you like to weigh in on this one? If not, I'm happy to jump to the next. Cool. Another question is the investment tax credit for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage for oil and gas, among other things, are up to 50%, whereas for renewables and other things, it's between 20 to 40%. What do you think about the fact that it's lower for renewables and other things?
I can go again if you want. I mean, I think the economist answer is that in the government's assessment, that percentage is what is necessary to kind of tip the scales in terms of an investment decision. So it may be the case that a lot of renewable electricity or these other clean tech projects are almost viable, they're almost competitive with conventional, and that 10% is what makes a difference. And so that's what they've determined will make the biggest difference, because you don't want to provide more of a subsidy than is necessary to induce that investment. And then conversely, I mean, certainly this is what the oil companies have been saying, is the incentive is not enough for us to do it. Like, we're still making enough money selling oil and gas that we'd rather just eat the carbon price or whatever and not worry about CCUS. So in that context, it needed to be a higher incentive. Although I personally still don't think we should be. I think we would rather just regulate CCUS, tell these companies they have to do it, and then they have to pay for it, rather than spending public money to support oil and gas production.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that as well. So this budget, most of the CCS investment tax credit, I think, was announced in last year's budget for the first time, correct? Yeah. And so this budget only kind of adds a little slice to it. I just wanted to draw attention to maybe one piece of analysis that we published a couple of weeks ago on that topic, that it doesn't look at the cost of CCS that Hadrian was just referring to, but just in kind of comparison of supports provided by the Inflation Reduction Act and what is currently available in Canada, policy supports for CCS, especially in the upstream oil and gas sector. So we're only looking at oil production here. And that analysis finds that in terms of dollar values per ton, what is available in Canada from, we're looking at Alberta specifically, most relevant province here, what is available from kind of carbon pricing and fuel standards and the CCUS investment tax credit. So stacking up all these supports, the supports actually exceed what the Inflation Reduction Act offers in the United States. So that argument of Canada needs more support for CCUS to remain competitive in that kind of direct comparison with the US Inflation Reduction Act, we didn't find evidence for that. We actually found that what Canada currently has in place and now in store already implemented exceeds what is available in the US. But we haven't looked at the cost side of CCUS. So the argument that Hadrian just put out, we haven't looked at that part of the component, just strictly at the US-Canada comparison.
Great, thanks, Marissa. And I do want to note it's just about time to start wrapping up our event. So I'll maybe ask one final question. Hadrian, if you do have to hop off to your next commitment, that's all good.
But I'll try and answer this question, then I do have to leave. I'm sorry, everybody.
Okay, awesome. I will ask it fast. Combining a couple, actually, the top voted one is, should we not be a lot more worried about the evidence that the government is not going to stop fossil fuel production, especially after the latest IPCC report that was released last week? And a related question is, are there any tangible steps to follow through on the old promises to remove subsidies for fossil fuel production?
If I may, I will go first, and I do apologize. I have to leave to pick up my kids. Short answer is, yeah, we should be worried. We should be taking this very seriously. The government is working on removing inefficient, quote, fossil fuel subsidies. It's just going slower than I think a lot of us would like. But there's the big issue with what the IPCC told us, and this is, again, my concern with leaving a lot of these things to the market, is not that the market wouldn't solve this eventually, but that we need to solve it now. And like a lot of the tax credits that were just introduced, they don't even come into effect until 12 months from now. And it's like every month counts right now. And I'd like to see the government moving a lot faster, even if it's not quite as efficient, even if we make some mistakes along the way. We need to transition much more aggressively than we are. And on that note, I will say goodbye, but thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Hadrian. And I will also allow the other panelists to weigh in on the question if you'd like.
Just a quick note, maybe. So we're still waiting for or hoping for a cap on oil and gas emissions this year. So that's an important piece of policy and legislation that might address some of these concerns. Other than that, I don't think I have anything more to add to that question. Thanks.
I'll just quickly add that, yeah, I think we really need to be concerned with that report and just, you know, what's happening right now. And I do agree with Hadrian that a lot of this is left to the markets. I think that's important, you know, markets being involved, but I would like to see from government some direction as well, given the urgency of this situation.
Great. Thank you, Runa. And with that, I do want to thank all of our panelists, Runa, Marissa, and Hadrian, for joining us today. I know that was incredibly helpful for me to understand the nuances of this budget, that it does move the needle. There's some really positive signs and big investments in the energy transition that are really exciting to see and exciting to see the implementation of in the coming years. And that there are also still some areas where we need to see a lot more specificity, clarity, and, you know, direct inclusion in the budget for this to be a whole picture of the energy transition. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise. There's a lot more questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to, unfortunately, but I'm so glad that everyone was able to join us and tune in. So I will pass it over to Sarah for some closing remarks, but thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Shakti, and to all of our panelists for their really excellent and interesting perspectives. I definitely learned a lot from this. I'd like to also thank you because this budget is fresh and you probably crammed a lot over the last couple of days to be ready for this panel and to do your analysis. So we're particularly grateful. I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support for our work in making it possible to hold events like these. I'd like to thank my team that worked to put this event together. And we'd love to have your feedback. My colleague is going to drop a very short survey in the chat if you have a couple of minutes to let us know what you thought about the event. And I'd like to thank each of you for your interest in the budget and learning more here. The budget is a cycle. It is strengthened by the input of advocates, and that cycle, I know it might be incredible to think, but it starts up again in June with pre-budget consultations and then written submissions in the fall. So I hope you'll stay engaged in driving environmental policies in Canada and in our work. So thank you again to everybody, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care.